guys, let's take a look at the Celtics side of things. We haven't really talked about this here. We're 20 minutes in, and we got people asking. So obviously the Springer move yesterday, right? Clay, in X, you shake your head because you're a big Springer believer. So we could start you off here. So you move Springer, you clear 15 million off the books, right? This is a deal that you knew Springer at some point coming into the season, right? We thought maybe at first they were going to deal him to just open up a spot for Walker. However, Brad was unable to do that. So moving forward, we kind of look at Springer as a piece that can maybe get you something on the back end of this roster, maybe another forward, maybe another big man, right? Fast forward to, rewind, I guess now, but yesterday hits and Boston moves off of Springer, right? They don't get anything returned. They get this draft pick. And then, that opens up a TPE, right? Which is, I believe, $4 million. Boston has until 3:00 today to use it. Now, do you see Boston making any moves? Is it with the Springer TPE? Is it moving Tillman? Is it elevating Peterson, who I personally think this is the move that happens, to that 14th, and I call it the 14th and final roster spot because Brad's not filling that 15th. He's keeping that open. So what do you see coming from the Boston side of things, X?
I don't disagree with you. I think they've been rather complacent the last few months with everything. Let's start with the Springer thing first, though. Regardless what you think of Springer as a player, I think it sets a bad precedent that you trade the guy who plays by far the hardest on your roster. And for a long time, people have talked about their concerns with the toughness level of this team, and I've never really bought into that because I think it's tough to beat a team that makes shots the way the Celtics have throughout the last year and a half. And they don't need to have this moxie and flex and get into arguments with teams to show their toughness. It proves in their game. But I think what Springer does bring is a different level of tenacity and an ability to raise his play when it matters. And regardless of how good you think he is, like I mentioned, it's that energy that this team needs in spurts. And trading a guy like that, I think, just sets a bad precedent because regardless of saving the money, he was a guy who came in and genuinely shifted the culture of the team when he was in there. And if Jaden Springer can do that, then what does that say about the rest of the team at points? And I think too much this year, we've seen this team look flat at times. We've seen this team look low energy. We've seen this team coast, and that's totally fine because they're the defending champions, and that's what happens in the NBA. But I think it's a dangerous game to trade a guy who can kind of negate that in spurts and raise the boats of everyone else's energy. But regardless of what is the Celtics going to do today, I think moving Tillman would be a good idea. I think the entire acquisition has been a flop. I think for the most part of his tenure, they've tried to make him an Al Horford 2.0, Al Horford in waiting, and that's been a disaster. That's not his play style. I think it's been a miss by the coaching staff and the organization as a whole to try to make him something he's just really not. And it's kind of deteriorated his impact on the team. And getting off of him wouldn't be a bad move. And if you're going to elevate Drew Peterson, that's fine. I'm not going to be the first to say I'm excited about that. I think Drew's a decent player. I've seen him plenty in college here in Eugene when he was with the Trojans. He's fine. He has the okay handle. He's a streaky shooter that when it goes in, it looks really good. He's competitive on defense more than people give him credit for, but I think that's still going to be a problem. And if your deadline move is moving off Springer and or Tillman and elevating Peterson, what does that say about the we don't really have an owner right now, but what does that say about the lack of ownership? Because if the standard is the Golden State Warriors of the last decade, Joe Lacob always paid the tax. Joe Lacob always made these marginal moves to make that team better. Okay. And if you're not going to even attempt to try to do that, when you have this window, which you have Tatum and Brown, but guys like Drew, guys like Porzingis, guys like Holiday are going to be tough to contain during this second apron era. Thank you, CJ McCollum. Then you have to go all out for it when it matters. And I think this move just shows complacency, and I hate that when you have this title window. I just feel like they're sitting on their hands, and I hate that personally.
Can I push back on that a little bit? And the
Please do.
only thing I would say is, so like, you're right. Thank you, CJ McCollum, CBA. That's where the crux of this issue is, right? Because even going for it, like when you look at the Celtics salaries because they can't aggregate salaries, right? They can't put
Right.
two salaries together and go get a $10 million guy. So you got to look at, who out of that group that you would, because the question is, are we going to do anything today? Like if we're just using the TPE or we're trying to trade minimum salaries, like you're super limited. Like Yabusele to me is the only interesting guy, unless I'm missing somebody that could potentially be out there. That's one of the only somewhat rumored names I've seen that I actually think is appealing and could make a difference. Otherwise, I think it's going to be more kind of just, a Tillman level move, which, hey, shout out to Tillman for that 1 3-pointer in game 3. That was a big moment. So at least we'll always have that when it comes to Xavier Tillman. But, for them going all in, quote unquote, or pushing their chips in and not being complacent, I just don't really see, unless you're willing to trade Drew Holiday now versus the offseason, like, which I don't think there's probably going to be a deal out there that would make sense. Like, I just don't know what salary you're moving that's gonna move the needle. And that's, to me, that's more of just the CBA than it is whatever. To your point, whoever's running the things as our ownership right now is making the call. Is I just think they're just extremely limited on what they could do right now.
Well,
I think that's a valid point.
Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on that before we pass the rock around. I think that's a valid point. I think my issue with the entire situation is I just don't feel bad for them getting under the cap and getting under the second tax rather. And I understand why they do that, and I truly do. But at the same time, this is the reigning defending champions, and saving money during a title push, I'm just never going to get on board with that. And again, I understand the reasons why the impact the move makes is greater than the play he was providing on the court at this time. But even a few nights ago against Cleveland, late in that game, the Celtics were a disaster defensively for like a 3-minute stretch. And I was sitting there and I was like, who would be awesome in this game right now? Jaden Springer, just for 2 minutes, just to run around and show his energy. And I think just that on the roster was never fully unlocked by Joe Maz. And I just would have liked to see a little bit more of it. We got a little bit of a sprinkle in the last few weeks, but I just wanted to see a little bit more to see where that could go.
I think that was just to try to trade him, probably, instead of just getting off him for nothing.
Oh, exactly.
I agree with you on the energy part, though.
I think that's kind of the Springer experience over the past 3 weeks, was them trying to showcase him. Hey, league, look what this guy can do defensively. He's kind of a pest, and he's kind of so. I fully trust Brad Stevens. I mean, maybe it's I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt, but I really do believe that every move he makes, it's coming from. It's the best move to be made. I think they shopped him. I think they checked the market, and I don't think there was anything out there. I don't think I don't think right now teams are looking at Boston and necessarily interested in making a move with us. I think a lot of them are kind of like, am I getting fleeced? Am I adding fuel to what this already beast of a team is? So I think, one, you could look at that aspect, and two, I agree with you, Will, where you look around the league right now, and how much is there really to add to this roster that's going to, in a playoff series, an 8-man rotation playoff series, really give us a lot. And I think from that aspect, if you're Boston, you're going to kind of have to stand pat. I mean, this core rotation deserves a second go at it. You're not going to move anybody in there. And, from the back end side of things, I agree with you, X. I think Springer is a great regular season guy to bring in and keep these guys going against, lower quality teams. But I don't think this is really a move. I mean, it's a little frustrating, right? You save $15 million in a team that's worth $1 billion. Or multiple billion, but I don't think there's a market out there for Springer, and I think that's just the harsh truth about it.
No, there's definitely not a market out there for Springer, because if there was, he would have been gone at the beginning. He would have been gone at the and here comes Randy. We just saw a comment on the bottom. We want to. Yep,
Let's
here we
go,
go. I want to hear
Randall.
Randy's takes on the entire deadline. But let me touch on Springer real quick before we kick it on over to Randy real quick, because there was no market for Springer at the beginning of the season, because if there was, the Celtics would have traded him before the season. And the reason they would have done that is because they were trying to clear his $4 million off the books at the beginning of the year to go and sign Lonnie Walker to the roster. And what ended up happening was no team wanted to trade for Jaden Springer, and no offers were fielded by the Boston Celtics. and Brad Stevens. And of course, we saw Jaden Springer on the roster this season, and Lonnie Walker, he was waived at the beginning of the year. If Jaden Springer, if at the beginning of the year, Brad Stevens was able to move on from Jaden Springer, he would have, because he was the 8th highest paid player. Jaden Springer was the 8th highest paid player on the Boston Celtics, yet you really cannot say he's the 8th best player on the Boston Celtics. And ultimately, I will say this as well. There was a report that came out earlier this season that the Boston Celtics, they were gauging the interest on Jaden Springer around the league. They weren't gauging the interest. Brad Stevens wasn't gauging the interest of Jaden Springer. He was frantically looking all over the league in order to ship off Jaden Springer's contract, and there were no buyers. There were no takers of Jaden Springer's contract, and that was all to sign Lonnie Walker at the beginning of the season. Didn't happen, and now, of course, later on down the line, the Celtics ship out Jaden Springer and his $4 million. It, of course, saves them $15 million on the luxury tax bill, in which is coming out of the owner's pocket, whichever owner's pocket it's coming out of at this point in time. But I will say I agree with X on the fact that this team is cheaped out so far in terms of re-pursuing a title. We saw it at the beginning of the year with Lonnie Walker. If they really wanted Lonnie Walker, give him the minimum, add to the luxury tax bill, and we have Lonnie Walker to come off the bench. Instead, the team goes cheap. They let Lonnie Walker go, and then now we're seeing at the deadline, and Jaden Springer, he's out the door. But I also will point out with this as well, the Celtics are going to save money by trading away Jaden Springer, and we'll see what they do with Tillman later in the day. But if they trade off those two players, and specifically Springer here, and then add in 2 veteran minimum contracts or just minimum contracts, they'll be able to fill their roster. And it could be a buyout candidate, could be a guy like Kyle Anderson, who knows at the end of the day, who could be a little better than Jaden Springer. But that is also going to save the Celtics money while also adding to the roster. And I think, too, it could add a couple of better players to the roster. But I will say, Jaden Springer, he was a player that we needed to see more of in the last couple of weeks. We only saw him really in that Clippers game. We saw him in spurts here and there. But really, Jaden Springer, at the moment in which the Celtics were really struggling, we should have seen Jaden Springer a lot more, because his defensive presence was impactful out on the floor, and you really cannot say enough good things about defensive players. His offensive game certainly has a long way to go in the NBA, but his defensive game, it is almost at an elite level, and I really wonder where Jaden Springer can go still in his NBA career, because he's still 22, 23 years old. He's going to the Houston Rockets. Who knows if they'll even keep him on the roster or what they'll do with them. But Jaden Springer, there's certainly some potential there from the defensive end of the floor. Offensively, it's a complete mess, I will say. But defensively, Jaden Springer was certainly a highlight on this Boston Celtics team. But at the end of the day, the play sometimes doesn't matter. We see really with the Phoenix Suns, and we've seen it across the league. The play sometimes just doesn't matter. It's about cutting that money, saving money. And I will say I agree with X in the fact that I'm just not in with the Celtics cheaping out right now in terms of
Could I just
pursuit of a championship. They're cheaping
hold
out.
on?
They could pay more money, and they're not doing it. They're cutting fringe. They cut Lonnie Walker at the beginning of the year to save
I'm going to
money.
disagree.
That's what they did.
All right, they did, and obviously Justin, Randy, how we doing, guys? Welcome in. Real quick, I'm going to let you guys go, but I just want to say something. I think this cheaping out narrative you guys are starting, I'm not sure if I'm a fan of it.
But it's true. See, it's not a narrative. It's true, because if it wasn't true, we would have Lonnie Walker. We would have just kept Jaden Springer on the roster. But we're not.
I think what you're seeing is the harsh reality of the second apron NBA. And this is a team that is paying almost $1 billion to their top 5 guys.
I was going to say
they extended
5-6 years.
Right, 5-6 years. They extended Holiday, they extended White. They locked up Tatum this offseason. I mean, they emptied their pockets where it was needed. Have they kind of danced around the back half of the roster? Absolutely, I think. I think they have. But I mean, this money they're pouring into their top guys is just ridiculous, and it really handicaps you. I don't think you don't have the luxury to make those moves at the back end of your roster when you're a team like Boston, just because they are financially in they're handicapped right now, and I don't know. I sure have they skimped out a little bit towards the back end, but to say this team's cheaped out, I think is very unfair to management from just how much money they've poured into the starters.
I mean, that's a fair point, but at the same time, I think you just if you want to go big, you're either going to go big or you're going to go home, and they
Which
went
is
home on the
fair.
back end of the
It's
roster.
fair to be frustrated, I
But
think.
I will say I will have to see the narrative of this playing out too, because they extended Holiday and White, and Porzingis is still on a big deal, and he's actually what's funny about Porzingis playing well lately is the fact he's actually the next one up for an extension, and that's really I think his motivation at this moment in time. But Tatum and Brown as well, huge contracts. But I think in the future we'll see the Celtics, they'll put their money where their mouth is or they won't, because I think in the future we could see one of the guys we're talking about right now. Oh, they threw big bucks at the starting five. That's true. But at some point in time, they could go, oh, Holiday, maybe he's not worth this money. Oh, I wouldn't bet Derek White. I wouldn't bet Tatum. Brown, we'll see in the future, I think, too. Yeah, Brown has to be a conversation still in the future. I know we think of Brown and Tatum as the pillars, but obviously we just saw Luka Doncic be moved. So it's in terms of, and Jalen Brown doesn't have the same problems as Luka Doncic by any means, but you can see anything. The point is, anything could happen in the NBA. And you really look at Porzingis as well. You never know when this team could eventually go, you know what? We're not really down to pay these dollars moving into the future. And one thing that kind of worries me just a little bit is the fact the ownership is changing. Now it could be the Celtics could fall into the hands of a richer owner than they have now, or richer owners, I will say. But at the same time, anytime you're changing ownership, there's a culture change within the building as well, and really a way of spending. I will say it too. So it's going to be an interesting conversation moving into the future in terms of what they'll do with even the top half of the roster. But for this year, I really do think the Celtics, in terms of really filling out the entire roster, did cheap out. But I do agree with your point
Yeah,
still, Rob, of
that's
the fact
fair.
that they did spend at the top.